Hinduism is a broad term that we use to encompass a vast range of religious beliefs and practices with origins in India. So we are going to talk today about the rise of Hinduism and the origins of Buddhism. As you can see on the timeline here, 4000 BCE marks the earliest traces of Hinduism that we can find, and this is before the Aryan invasion, so we call this pre-Vedic. And then 1750 BCE, this is the origins of Vedic Hinduism. This is generally when Hinduism is said to have originated. And then around 500 BCE is when Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, when he lived. So note that the life of Siddhartha Gautama, it kind of coincides with the life of Confucius. There was a vibrant religious culture going on in the 6th century BCE that gave rise to many new religions and philosophies and ways of life. The Hindu texts called the Vedas and the Upanishads date from the Vedic period. And so, as I mentioned before, by Vedic period, I'm referring to the time after the arrival of the Aryans, those Proto-Aryan groups from Eastern Europe who came and settled in India. So this is one of the reasons that the Aryans were believed to have had a transformative effect on Hinduism, because Hinduism's main texts were not written until the arrival of the Aryans. But in reality, most of the building blocks of Hinduism existed in India before the arrival of the Aryans. And the Aryans' arrival sort of just marks the recording of the texts and not the beginnings of the religion altogether. We just obviously don't have the documentation for earlier forms of Hinduism since they weren't written down, but archaeologists have been able to use objects to reconstruct ancient forms of Hinduism. Sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, the mixing of Aryan and Harappan culture produced a hybrid culture, and that's what we call Vedic culture. It was during this time that the Vedas were written down. In the Vedas, the trinity of Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiva were codified. So were the complex beliefs, references to other minor deities, and Vedic rituals that are still practiced today. The emergence of Hinduism marks the earliest conception of a supreme being, and this was Brahma. Brahma purportedly created Vishnu and Shiva, the two other primary divinities in Hinduism. So it's maybe worth mentioning that there's some debate over whether Brahma or Vishnu came first, but for our purposes here, we're going to go with Brahma. Some Hindu divinities predate the purported Aryan invasion in 1750 BCE. And as I think I mentioned in the Harappan submodule, in Module 1, was that there were, in the Harappan culture, thousands and thousands of years before the advent of Hinduism, we have evidence that they worshipped gods that appear to look just like Brahma and Vishnu. So it's worth mentioning that these sort of evolved over time. They weren't just invented when the Aryans invaded India. But nonetheless, Vedic Hinduism is the Hinduism that we know today. So this little chart sort of shows how Hinduism works. Dharma is your actions. These are the things that you do in every day of your life. Karma, on the other hand, is a sum total of your life actions. And some scholars refer to karma as sort of an accumulation of the residue of good and bad action. So when you commit a good action, you get good karma. You kind of build up this good residue. And when you perform bad actions, you build up this sort of bad residue. At the foundation of Hindu belief is the process of samsara, which is the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. The soul, known as Atman, is recycled. So this cycle is exhausting. It's draining. It's not necessarily a good thing. The ultimate goal is the release from this cycle of samsara, and that release is called moksha. Sometimes moksha is referred to as Hindu heaven. It's not so much a place as it is a state of being. It means liberation or emancipation, from this punishing cycle of samsara. Brahma, who I mentioned earlier, is generally known as the creator. And here is a depiction of Brahma. Shiva is generally known as the dancer or the destroyer. Vishnu is known as either the preserver or the protector. Now, Vishnu has several avatars, and those are representations of himself. One of these avatars of Vishnu's is Krishna. Krishna is the divinity around whom the Bhagavad Gita revolves. So keep in mind when you're reading parts 1 and 2 for your module that he is an avatar of Vishnu, not just some minor deity. You see him here in a picture. It's an artist rendering of Krishna with Arjuna, who is the other main character in the Bhagavad Gita. Vedic Hinduism also gave birth to a complex system of social stratification. The caste system has both Vedic and pre-Vedic or Harappan origins. At the top are the Brahmin, not to be confused with Brahma, the god. The Brahmin are priests or academics, sort of like the literati at the top of the social structure by Confucius. And then under them is the Kshatriya. Those are warriors or kings or princes. Underneath them are Vaishya, which are farmers for the most part. Here they're labeled as merchants or landowners. They're not the poorest of farmers, so we don't mean farm hands, more like farm owners. And then Sudra, who are the commoners or peasants, farmhands, day laborers, and servants. And then beneath them we have the untouchables. They're also known as Dali. They're or polluters would be another way that they are referred to. And these are people who are not in the caste system. They are outside and below it. So street sweepers, latrine cleaners, anyone who has this sort of dirty, polluted job that is a job that's regarded in that way. And then below the untouchables even is the animal kingdom. The animal kingdoms are also sort of outside of caste. And Hindus believe that you could accumulate so much bad karma that you are reborn as a non-human animal. Now we're going to move on to Buddhism. The Buddha was born around the same time as Confucius, so in either the late 6th or early 5th century BCE. And his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was a real person. I want you to make sure that you watch the short video that I posted about the life of Siddhartha Gautama, and it sort of explains this foundation mythology for Buddhism that really does help explain a lot of where this philosophy is coming from. So please make sure that you watch that. I'm not going to spend time lecturing on that. The most basic beliefs of Buddhism are called the Four Noble Truths, and these are, first of all, that human life is full of suffering and sorrow, And the second is that suffering and sorrow are caused by people's greedy desires for power, pleasure, and possessions. So suffering is caused by desire. The third is that suffering and sorrow will end when people overcome their greed or desire. This will bring you to nirvana or enlightenment. And then fourth, people can overcome their greed and uncontrolled desires by adopting the middle way or eightfold path. So the Buddha not only explained what is wrong with life, but how one can overcome this. Here is a pictorial depiction of the eightfold path. You can see the Buddha recommends right view, right mindfulness, right concentration, right effort, all of these various avenues, things that you can do to achieve nirvana. Now, at the time of the Buddha's death in the 5th century BCE, India was split into several warring kingdoms, and there was immense suffering, poverty, famine, violence, all the things that go along with instability and war. So the Buddha's message resonated with Indians very powerfully. Buddhism spread rapidly. Even though it grew out of Hinduism and was influenced heavily by it, at the same time, Buddhism stood in opposition to Hinduism, threatening a way of life that Indians had ascribed to for thousands of years. The Bhagavad Gita, which is assigned to you, parts 1 and 2, was written around the same time as Siddhartha Gautama's death, and it was the Hindu response to the disruptive effect of Buddhism in India. This is a reminder that spirituality is intimately entwined with political and social authority. So even though this module is titled Interior Worlds, that's kind of just a way of organizing this information in a meaningful way. But as with any other organizational scheme, there's a problem with it. Religion, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, can't be confined to a purely interior world. They had very material effects on the political, economic, social, cultural world. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as the course progresses.